Hi, thanks for checking out this video. So today we're going to be looking at timing and spacing. And timing and spacing is really one of the most important principles I feel like to get nailed down within your animation as early as possible. Not only does it allow you to figure out kind of the weight and how things should move within your scene, but it's also there to really add a lot of appeal and variation in sort of the tempo of your animation or the rhythm of your animation. So it allows you to go in there and add in those really quick, fast moments into those slower moments back into like another fast moment, which allows you to create a really interesting kind of wave in your timing, adding in that contrast of fast and slow movements. So at first, let's go ahead and just take a look at timing and spacing at kind of its basic fundamental level. So timing is really how long it takes to go from one pose to the other within your animation. So in this sort of rough example here, we have a ball going from a position on the floor to a position in the air and then back to the floor. So kind of a basic ball bounce. So if we were to go from frame 0 to frame 15 in order for it to get from the floor into the top of the arc of the bounce, and that took 15 frames, that would be sort of the timing of that transition, how long it actually takes to go from that one main pose to the next main pose. And then it would take another 15 frames to go from the top of the arc back down to the ground. So really that would be a 30 frame bounce. And if you're working at 30 frames per second, which is what I typically work at, that would be a 1 second bounce. And that would be the timing of your animation, figuring out how long each action should actually take. And timing is also a key principle in ensuring your animations move believably and obey the laws of physics. Looking at these three objects here, we have a bowling ball, a basketball, and a tennis ball, and the timing on all three of these balls will vary greatly because it's the timing that really allows you to sell the weight. Obviously, the bounces for the tennis ball is going to be a lot faster than something like a bowling ball, and there's obviously going to be a lot more bounces within the tennis ball as well. But timing is really important for making your objects feel heavy or light and adds a lot of believability to your animations. If your timing is not right and it looks off, then your animation is obviously going to look off as well. So if, say, for example, you're animating a 20-foot tall dinosaur, obviously the steps that a giant dinosaur like that would take a lot longer to do than just a regular sized human. So that's kind of how you can think about, the variation of your timing in order to achieve different types of weight in your animation. And another really important aspect of timing is the spacing. And the spacing is really what is happening in between those main keyframes of your animations. You can sort of think of them as the in-between. So if we were to go to a ball bounce example, which we'll take a look at in just a moment, that spacing will allow you to create something that feels even more believable. So not only do you need to time the bounces properly, you need to make sure the spacing within those bounces is behaving properly and that there's that nice tight spacing at the top of the arc. And then as the ball starts to fall down, the spacing is going to get further and further apart. But this basic example here of spacing is even spacing. So this would be if you had this ball moving from screen left to screen right, and the placement for each individual frame of that animation, the placement on that ball is exactly the same. This is going to give you a constant even speed and a more robotic type of feeling. This is something you might want if you're maybe animating something like a vehicle driving down the road where it's having to maintain a constant even speed as it's driving. And this is something that typically, again, you would want for something that's pretty robotic. This is not something you would really find all that much in real life. A very mechanical type of spacing like this is pretty much impossible to achieve unless it is something kind of mechanical like that. And another kind of principle of spacing is the ease in, ease out, or slow in, or slow out, whatever you want to call it. That is actually one of the 12 principles of animation, ease in and ease out. But actually I like to think of it just as another variation on spacing, because the spacing is what allows you to achieve your ease in and ease out, where you're actually placing the position of your object in each one of your keyframes. So here we have an ease in, which gives us the feeling of acceleration. So you can see the placement of the ball on each one of these frames at the beginning is really close together, which is going to give you that acceleration feeling. So it's going to start slowly and then pick up speed as it moves across the screen. And then we have the ease out, which is kind of the opposite of that. You can see the spacing on the first couple frames, the ball is really far apart. And then as it comes to a stop, that spacing is closer and closer together, giving you the feeling of deceleration. So now I want to take a little bit deeper of a look at spacing and timing for your animation inside this example scene that I've created in Blender here. So what we have are these three objects. They're moving across the screen from screen left to screen right. And I can go ahead and play it here. And you can see the variation or the speed changes between each one of these objects. Now, all of these objects have the exact same timing. They're all stopping at the exact same frame, and they're all starting at the exact same frame. So if I go ahead and pause it here, if I select any one of these balls, you can see it's going to start at frame 1, and it's going to move across the screen and get to the end of its movement at frame 30. So we kind of have our timing established for all three of these objects. You can see all of them have the exact same timing. It's the spacing that we've changed in order to get a completely different feeling for these animations. So if I go ahead again and play it here, for the ball at the bottom, we have the even spacing. And if I look at the graph, you can see I have a perfect linear curve, and this is going to give us perfect even spacing. So you can see as I scrub forward in my animation, the ball's movement is increasing at the exact same amount for each frame. You can see it's perfectly even moving across the screen, and that is going to give us that kind of robotic type of feeling. You can see it doesn't feel quite natural. Now, if I take a look at the object in the middle, this actually has the ease out. So the placement at the end of this animation, the spacing is going to get tighter and tighter, giving us that deceleration. But if I go ahead and frame forward a couple frames, you can see just how much this object is moving over the first frame. So you can see it pops forward a lot and continues that pretty large spacing through all of this. And then as we get toward the end of the animation, you can see that spacing is getting closer and closer together. You can see the curve that we have here in the graph editor allowing us to achieve that. And you can see as we scrub forward these last couple frames, the ball is hardly moving. It's just moving just a couple pixels here over the last 3 or 4 frames. And again, this gives us that feeling of deceleration. And then up here at the top, we have kind of the opposite of that. So this ball is slowly accelerating. So you can see the spacing on this one, the ball is hardly moving over the first 3 or 4 frames. You can see if I scrub forward, you can see just how far behind it's lagging from the other two objects until finally probably around frame like 20 or so, it actually starts to pick up speed as that spacing starts to get further and further apart, giving us that nice feeling of acceleration on this object. So again, this is just a very basic example of timing and spacing, something you've probably seen quite a bit in the past, but it's always good to kind of get a quick refresher on that. So in this next example, we have 2 different types of ball bounce animations. If you are new to animation and you haven't animated a ball bounce, I highly recommend going through that process because it's one of the best ways to understand timing and spacing and allowing you to use that principle in order to achieve a completely different feeling of weight for 2 different objects. So I have these 2 objects here, and what I've done is for the ball on the right, I've created more of a basketball type of bounce for this object. There's quite a few more bounces and the timing is going to be different than the ball on the left. So the ball on the left is something a bit more closer to a heavier ball object like a bowling ball. So you'll see that the timing and the spacing and the amount of bounces varies quite a bit. And that is what allows us to achieve a completely different feeling of weight to these objects. Now, one important thing that I wanted to make sure that I did for this example, and if you're animating your own ball bounce, I highly recommend you do this as well. If you're trying to experiment with creating different types of weight for your bounces, is making sure your ball objects are the exact same size. It can be easy to go in here and actually increase the size of the heavier object because right away you'll kind of feel like if this object is so much larger than the other object, your brain is automatically going to think it's probably quite a bit heavier. But it's good to kind of constrain yourself into utilizing the exact same object, but changing up the weight to make them feel different. So you're relying on the animation, not the actual look of the object itself. So let's go ahead and just play this. And you can see, again, these are very simple ball bounces. They're not even moving across the screen, but you can see the variation in the feeling of weight for these. Obviously, the ball on the right, the kind of more basketball type of bounce, is going to have a lot more bounces to it, and it's going to take longer for that energy to die off. And that's another important aspect, is making sure you're getting believable weight in your animation, is that obviously you have to rely on the timing and spacing, but then you need to think about the object itself. If this object on the left is supposed to be a bowling ball, it's not going to bounce nearly as many times, and the bounces directly after it drops, that bounce is going to be pretty low in height because it is quite heavier. So again, that energy is going to die off a lot faster, which also will contribute to the feeling of weight in your animation. So you not only have to think about, the variation in the timing and the spacing to achieve that weight, you have to think about that object itself and how that's actually going to affect the energy through the bounces. And I can go ahead and select the ball on the right here, and you can see the graph for the up and down curve of this animation. And you can see the spacing that we're getting. We have this wide curve at the top of the arc, which is giving us that slow drop. So you can see the spacing is closer and closer together at the top of the arc, at the top of the bounces. And you can see the ball is slowly moving, slowly starts to drop. And then as it continues to drop, that spacing is going to get further and further apart until we have this giant jump in spacing here, and then another jump in spacing as soon as it hits, because it's going to bounce right back up after it hits the ground. And then as it hits the top of the arc, again, that spacing is going to get closer and closer together, and then slowly get further apart as it starts to drop back to the ground. And we have something very similar to that in the ball on the left, but you can see the amount of bounces that we have is quite different from the ball on the left. You can see we only have a couple bounces in here, and then the height of the bounces kind of immediately dies off for that heavier object there. So again, all of these principles are all working together to allow you to achieve a certain look in your animation. So now that we've kind of looked at timing and spacing at its kind of basic level, I want to take a look at a few animation examples here to look at timing and spacing that will allow you to create kind of more contrast and appeal in your animation, and start thinking about tempo and varying up the timing to create just a much more appealing animation. Again, timing and spacing is one of the most important principles to start to figure out as early on in your animation as you can. So this first example here is actually from a coworker, Justin Yoon, who's a really talented animator, and he's created this animation which I feel like shows a really great example of varying up your timing to add more contrast and a bit more variation in the tempo of your animation. So if I go ahead and play this, play it all the way through here, and then we can kind of frame by frame it. But what he's created here is a really great contrast in the movements. So what we have, especially right here, as the character kind of swings the legs around and then kicks up, we have this variation in fast and slow movements. So right off the bat, the character comes in really quickly, slams on the ground. You can see that's happening really quickly all through here. And then it starts to slow down right in here, this almost like kind of held moment at this position where the legs are swinging around, but the character's kind of staying in that one position. So all through here, we have this long held moment. So we've just come from a really fast movement into a slow movement. And then right in here, you can see we go from that slow movement into another really quick pop in spacing and a really big increase in speed as they kick off the ground. And then right after we have that really big fast motion right there, we go into this sort of held moment in the air where, again, it kind of slows down, where we can read this action very clearly. And if you were to track the hips on this movement, basically what's happening here is the same thing that we just looked at in our ball bounce example. You can see the spacing pops forward really quickly. And then if we were to track the hips, you can see the spacing is getting closer and closer together at the top of the arc. And then as the character starts to fall to the ground, the spacing gets further and further apart. So again, as we play this through here, you can see the variation in the timing of these actions, the really fast, quick actions into that really slow section with the legs swinging out allows us to read that, and then gives us that really great contrast in this animation between those fast and slow movements, which is so important to nail in your animation to create something that just feels a lot more appealing. So the last example I want to take a look at here is actually of a couple examples, and these are all from Halo Infinite, and these are all reload animations. If you want to study contrast in timing and contrast in spacing and see how it relates to animation and how to think about that in your animation. I find looking at first-person animations is one of the best ways to do that, because with first-person animations, you have to really fine-tune the timing of your animation to make sure it's completely readable to the player. But typically with first-person animations, you're working within a pretty tight time constraint, so you're having to do everything really quickly, so you need to pick apart those moments that are most important for the player to read. And we can see a lot of those examples in these first-person reload animations. And this first one right off the bat is probably one of my favorites because it's so quick, but again, it's so readable of what's happening here. So if I just frame by frame this, you can kind of pick apart the moments, the key moments for the fast and slow sections of this animation and how they've timed this out in order to make sure that it can be quick and you can get back to gameplay, but it's still readable for the player. So right here, we have the hand coming up to put in the magazine. And again, you can see this really big pop in spacing from here to here to really sell the force that the character is putting in to this reload animation. And then right after that big pop in spacing, we have this held moment where there's still some movement obviously happening. We have some shake on the gun. The hand is still kind of moving, but we're more or less staying within this held pose of the hand at the bottom of the gun. And this is that first really clear moment where we have the hold in the animation to make this nice and clear to the player. So we have these couple frames here where it holds and then the hand comes around quickly, and then right here we have another hold where we can clearly see the player is grabbing this section of the gun, and you can see we have this pop right here where again we have another hold. There's still some movement going on, so you can see the hand is still moving, the weapon is kind of raising up as well. But if we were to just look at the fingers, you can see it's basically kind of maintaining that same position through these last couple frames here. So again, we have this nice held moment, and then that giant pop in spacing here. You can see just how kind of exaggerated the spacing is to make sure it feels nice and snappy right here. And again, right after this giant pop in spacing, we have this held moment to kind of show the force that that put on the gun, and then it goes back to the default pose there. But we can just play this all the way through. And again, this animation is so quick because you have to be able to get back to gameplay really quickly, but it's really important to find those key points in your animation to make sure it's really clear. And again, reload animations are a great thing to study, to figure out and see how other animators are thinking about timing and using timing to add a bit more kind of rhythm and tempo to the animation. And we can scrub through this battle rifle animation. And again, all of the key moments have been picked out here to make sure that they're held very clear to the player. And you can see this right here, the hand comes up really quickly, and then there's a held moment. So we have a really fast motion to a slow movement here for about 3 or 4 frames as the hand holds this position, make sure it's clear to the player, then quickly pops in spacing to bring it back out. And you can see it comes in, kind of clicks in there, and then again the hand pushes it in, and then we have the other held moment for this animation. And there's a couple other really good examples here that I want to take a look at. I think in this commando weapon here, this reload I like quite a bit because again, there's just clear points that have been picked out that are most important to show the player and most important to make sure you have that kind of slow section of your animation. Because if everything was timed roughly the same, where everything was just happening really quickly, it wouldn't be nearly as clear to the player and it just wouldn't be as appealing. So here we have the hand coming up, and then it's basically just holding this position. You can see how many frames have been utilized in this reload animation just on this held moment. So even though the fingers are still moving and they're coming together to grasp this, you can see that it's still maintaining roughly the same kind of screen space, and it's still maintaining roughly the same pose through all of this. You're clearly seeing the players grabbing this section, and then we have that big pop in spacing to show them pulling it back. And we can play that all the way through here and just see how clear these beats of this animation are. And there's a couple other weapons I want to look at. I think it's this shotgun here. And this example is really good for showing those held moments in the reload animation. So if I play this first all the way through, you can see clearly what's happening in this reload animation. And really there's a very small amount of frames to work with for this animation. Again, you have to get back to gameplay really quickly. So this reload animation can't take a long time. So you need to be really methodical about where you're adding in your holds in order to help sell the animation. So probably the most amount of frames in this animation are put on the hand grabbing the barrel. So you can see over a couple frames, the hand comes off the weapon and grabs the barrel. And as soon as it grabs the barrel, you can see how long it's held in this section. So there's a little bit of a twist to show the character kind of unlocking the barrel. So the hand is kind of held here and it has this quick little twist motion. And then as soon as it does that twist, it pops. And you can see how long we're just held in this moment, all through these frames to clearly show what's happening here. And then we have this giant pop in spacing from here to here to show the character kind of forcefully twisting the barrel out. And then as soon as it pops here, it's just completely held for several frames all through this section. And then again, a big pop in spacing to show the force pulling that out. You can see the majority of the frames within this animation are put on these key held moments to show exactly what's happening to the player. So as the character brings in the barrel, it needs to hold here to kind of show that quick little snap right before he brings the hand up and actually snaps it into the gun. So there's like 3 really key held moments in this animation where a lot of the frames are used in order to sell it. And this last one I want to take a look at is this shock rifle here. And this is another great one where we have this clear held moment here. As soon as that hand grabs the top, we have several frames where it's just held here. You can see how many frames are used on this one section of the animation because that's what you need in order to really sell this action. So again, we have this long held moment and then this big pop in spacing where the hand kind of tears this off and then disappears basically over 1 frame. So we have that giant pop in spacing here and then immediately kind of disappears off screen. And then we have the hand bringing up the extra cartridge and kind of what we've seen in the past. And we have these key held moments in here between each one of these actions to really show the force that the character is putting into these and then also make sure it's readable to the person playing the game. So you can see by just looking through these reload animations, it's a great way to study timing and spacing and study sort of the variation you can add in your animation, the fast and slow sections of your animation that will allow you to add a lot of contrast and a bit more appeal to your animation. Because if everything is happening all at the same time and there aren't those nice held moments in your animation, everything's going to feel just kind of muddy and not quite as clear. So hopefully this kind of basic look at timing and spacing has been helpful for you, and hopefully you can see kind of where you can start to think about this in your own animation. So as always, if you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. And if you thought this video was helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for future content.